A man lay on a parlor floor in a spreading dark stain of his own making, his leg bound in a torn shirt. Across the room, his bride-to-be slept in a velvet chair, a wine glass tilting in her loose fingers, her breath even and untroubled. Between them, on her knees in the lamplight, a kitchen maid pressed a cloth to his wound and did not look away. The Hale Ranch sat in a wide bowl of Wyoming grassland, 18 years built up from a single sod house into the largest cattle operation in the county. Old Mr. Hale had died the previous spring, and his son Samuel ran it now, a man of 29, who had learned early that nothing was given and everything was held. He believed a home was a thing you earned through ledgers kept straight and fences kept sound. What he had never been taught, and did not yet know he lacked, was the difference between a house that is full and a house that is warm. Rose Bell came to the Hale Ranch in the autumn of 1889, hired into the kitchen because the cook needed hands and Rose needed wages. She was 23, orphaned at 14, and had spent the years since moving from one household to another, learning each family's particular silences. She was not pretty in the way the county admired. Her face was plain and steady, her hands roughened, her hair pinned back without vanity. But she watched. She had learned that watching was a kind of survival, and over the years it had become something gentler than that, a way of knowing what people needed before they thought to ask. The household ran to a strict order. There was the cook, two stablemen, a housekeeper named Mrs. Pruitt who guarded propriety like a creed, and the ranch hands who came and went with the seasons. Above them all moved Samuel Hale, courteous and remote, a man who paid fairly and spoke little. And lately there was Vivian Caraway, daughter of a banking family from Cheyenne, who had arrived in the spring wearing dresses that cost more than the cook earned in a year. The engagement had been arranged through the long, careful negotiations that joined fortunes. Vivian was beautiful in a way that made men forget their own sentences. The county had decided the match was perfect, and the county was rarely contradicted. Rose noticed things others did not. She noticed that Samuel ate alone at the long table while Vivian took her meals upstairs. She noticed that Vivian's laughter came only when guests were present, and that her interest in the ranch ended at the parlor door. She noticed that Samuel, walking the fence lines at dusk, sometimes stood a long while looking at nothing. The way a man looks when the life he has built does not fit the shape of his chest. None of this was Rose's to mention. She kept her observations folded away with her other quiet inheritances, and she did her work. And she expected nothing to change. The accident came on a gray morning in late October. Samuel rode out with 3 hands to move cattle off the high pasture before the first hard freeze. A storm had loosened a slope of shale above the creek, and as the herd pressed through the narrow draw, the ground gave way. His horse went down on the scree, and Samuel went down with it, his leg pinned and torn against the broken rock before the animal scrambled free. The hands carried him home across 2 miles of frozen ground, white-faced and silent, his trouser legs soaked dark. They laid him on the parlor floor because the stairs were too narrow to manage, and someone shouted for the doctor, and someone shouted for Vivian, and the house filled with the particular panic of a thing that should not have happened happening anyway. The doctor lived 11 miles off, in town, and the rider sent for him would not return before midnight at the soonest. That left the household to manage the long hours between Mrs. Pruitt took charge with brisk authority, calling for boiled water and clean linen. But her hands shook when she saw the wound, and she confessed in a low voice that she had no skill with injuries of this kind. The stablemen hovered, useless and afraid. The cook wept into her apron. And through all of it, the question hung unspoken in the room. Where was the woman who was meant to marry him? Vivian had been fetched. She came down from her rooms in a dressing gown, looked once at the blood, and pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. She said she could not bear the sight of it. She said she felt faint, that her nerves were delicate, that surely the doctor would come soon, and there was nothing to be done until then. She sank into the velvet chair by the window and asked, in a small, wounded voice, whether someone might bring her a glass of wine to settle her. The cook, too rattled to refuse, brought it. Vivian held it and looked out at the darkening yard and said it was all simply too terrible, and within an hour the strain and the wine had closed her eyes. Rose stood in the doorway with a basin in her hands. She was not asked. The kitchen maid was the last person in that house anyone would think to call upon, and she knew it. She also knew that the bleeding had not stopped, that the cloth wrapped round his leg had gone heavy, that Samuel's color was wrong, and that no one in the room knew what to do about any of it. She had nursed before. In one of the households of her drifting years, an old woman had taught her how to clean a wound and stop a bleeding, how to keep a fever from climbing, how to coax broth into a body that wanted to refuse it. It was knowledge that no one had ever valued in her, the kind of skill a servant carries and is never asked to spend. To step forward now would be to forget her place entirely. Mrs. Pruitt would not forgive it. The household would talk. A maid did not kneel at the master's side and put her hands upon him, not while his betrothed slept 10 feet away, not ever. But the cloth had gone heavier still, and his breath had gone shallow, and Rose understood with a cold certainty that propriety would not save him, and that she might. She thought of all the years she had spent making herself small enough to be permitted to stay, and she thought that some things were larger than permission. She set down the basin, crossed the room, and knelt. "I can help him," she said, to no one and to everyone. Her voice did not shake, though the rest of her did. She unwound the soaked binding with steady fingers and looked at the wound beneath, and did not flinch from it. "I need clean water, as hot as the kettle will give. Clean cloth, torn in strips, a needle and strong thread held in boiling water, and whiskey from the cabinet, all of it you can find." Mrs. Pruitt drew breath to object. Rose looked up at her, and something in the maid's plain, steady face stopped the words. The housekeeper turned and went for the linen. The cook went for the kettle. For the first time in her life, Rose had given an order in that house, and the house had obeyed. There was a boy among the ranch hands named Eli, 14 and small for it. He had been orphaned the same as Rose, taken on for stable work and the kindness of a roof. He had attached himself to her from his first week, drawn to the only person who spoke to him as though he mattered. He fetched and carried for her in the kitchen, and she saved him the heels of the bread, and between them had grown the quiet loyalty of two people who knew what it was to belong nowhere. It was Eli who crouched beside her now, white-faced, holding the lamp steady so she could see. "Tell me what to do," he whispered, and she told him, and he did it, and neither of them left. The first thing was to stop the bleeding. Rose worked by lamplight on the parlor floor while the household stood back in a loose, uncertain ring, half scandalized and half grateful, none of them willing to take her place, and none quite able to look away. She pressed a folded cloth hard against the worst of the wound and held it there, counting slow under her breath, the way the old woman had taught her years ago in a cold farmhouse kitchen. "Pressure and patience," the woman had said. "The body wants to heal. Your work is only to give it the chance." The bleeding slowed. When she lifted the cloth at last, she could see the wound clearly for the first time. A long, deep tear down the outside of his thigh and calf, where the rock had opened him. It was bad, but it was not the worst it might have been. No great vessel had been cut, or he would already be gone. The bone, when she pressed gently along its length, seemed whole. What he needed was cleaning and closing and watching and time. She sent Eli for the hot water and washed the wound with a care that bordered on tenderness, sponging away the grit of the scree and the dried blood, working from the center outward so as not to carry dirt deeper in. Samuel stirred and groaned. He had drifted in and out since they brought him in, lost in the gray country between waking and the dark. Now his eyes opened, fever-bright and confused, and found her face above him. "Who?" he began. "Rose, sir, from the kitchen. You've had an accident. I'm cleaning your leg, and it's going to hurt when I do, and I'm sorry for it. But it has to be done before the doctor comes, or you'll take a fever that finishes what the rock began." He stared at her. Perhaps he had expected a different face. Perhaps, in the swimming confusion of his pain, he had expected gold hair and a soft voice. What he got was a plain woman with rolled sleeves and water to the elbows, telling him the truth without dressing it up. He looked past her, searching the room, and his gaze found Vivian asleep in the chair. By the window, the wineglass still cradled against her lovely face slack and untroubled by anything at all. Something moved across his expression that Rose pretended not to see. She had learned that mercy sometimes means not witnessing a man's worst moment too closely. "Drink this," she said, and lifted a cup of whiskey to his lips. "It will dull the edge of what's coming. Not enough, but some." He drank. She gave him a folded strip of leather to bite, the kind the stablemen used on the horses, boiled clean. Then she threaded the needle she had held in the boiling kettle, and she began to close the wound. It was terrible work, and she did it well. Eli held the lamp and looked steadily at the wall above Samuel's head, his jaw clenched, his loyalty stronger than his fear. Mrs. Pruitt, to her credit, came forward at last, and held the basin and passed the cloths, her objections forgotten in the face of competence. Samuel bore it in rigid silence, the leather creaking between his teeth, sweat standing on his brow, his hands knotted into the rug. Rose worked steadily, her stitches small and even, pausing each time his breath caught to let him gather himself, then going on. She talked to him the whole while in a low, even murmur, not about the wound, but about ordinary things. The storm coming in, the cattle safe in the lower pasture, the kettle she'd have singing for broth by dawn. The sound of her voice was a rope thrown to a drowning man, and he held to it. When it was done, she bound the leg in clean strips, neither too tight nor too loose, and laid a folded blanket beneath it to raise it, and covered him to the chest against the chill. The whole thing had taken better than 2 hours. The lamp had burned low. Outside, the first snow of the year had begun to fall, silent against the black windows. "There," she said softly. "The hard part's behind you. Rest now." Samuel's eyes were closed, but his hand, where it lay near hers on the rug, turned over, and his fingers found her wrist and held it. Not gripping, only holding, the way a man holds the one solid thing in a world that has tilted. Rose went very still. Then she let him hold on. Across the room, Vivian slept and did not stir and knew nothing. The doctor came near 2 in the morning, stamping snow from his boots. He knelt by Samuel and unwound the bandages and examined the work that had been done, and Rose stood back against the wall with her hands folded in her apron, braced for him to find fault. Instead, he was quiet a long moment, studying the small even stitches, the clean edges of the wound, the careful binding. "Who did this?" he asked. "The kitchen maid, doctor, Mrs. Pruitt said, and there was something in her voice that had not been there hours before, not quite respect, but its near neighbor. The doctor looked over at Rose. "You've done this before. An old woman taught me, sir, years back. She taught you well. I couldn't have closed it neater myself, and I've the training." He set about checking the leg for signs of deeper trouble and found none. "He'll fever some. That's the body's way, but you've given him his best chance. Had this gone untended till I arrived, or been bound up wrong, we'd be having a different conversation." He glanced toward the window, where Vivian had finally roused at the noise and sat blinking, the wineglass set aside, her hair disordered, looking from face to face as though trying to understand what she had missed. The doctor's expression flickered and went carefully blank. "Keep it clean," he told Rose. "Change the dressing twice a day, broth and water when he'll take them. Send for me if the fever climbs past reason, or the leg goes hot and red around the wound. Can you manage that?" "I can, sir." "Then he's in good hands," he said it plainly, looking at her, and the words landed in the room like a verdict. The fever came, as the doctor promised. For 3 days Samuel burned, and for 3 days Rose scarcely left him. They had moved him to a low bed made up in the small downstairs room off the parlor, and she set her station there. She bathed his face with cool cloths through the long nights and coaxed broth between his cracked lips a spoonful at a time and changed the dressings, morning and evening, and each time the wound was cleaner and the flesh around it stayed pink and healthy rather than going the angry red that meant rot. She cooked before dawn so the kitchen would not fall behind, then carried bowls of broth she had made rich with marrow and herbs to the sick room, and fed him when he could not feed himself. Vivian visited twice. The first time she stood in the doorway with a scented handkerchief at her nose and said the room smelled of sickness, and she did not know how Rose could stand it. The second time she brought a book, meaning to read to him, but Samuel was sleeping and she did not care to wait, and she left the book on the table and went back upstairs to where the air was sweet. The book sat unopened. It was a volume of poems. Rose moved it aside to make room for the broth and did not think on it much. On the fourth day, the fever broke. Samuel woke clear-eyed in the gray light before dawn to find Rose asleep in the chair beside his bed. Sitting upright, her chin dropped to her chest, a half-darned sock still in her lap. She had not meant to sleep. She had been mending by the last of the lamp, and exhaustion had simply taken her. He lay and looked at her for a long while in the strengthening light, at the plain, tired face gone soft in sleep, at the cracked hands that had held him together, at the evidence written all over her of 3 days and nights spent keeping him in the world. He thought of another sleeping woman, and a wine-glass, and the particular sound of a house where no one is coming. And he understood, with the strange hard clarity that sometimes follows a fever, that he had very nearly married the wrong silence. When Rose woke, she found him watching her. She straightened quickly, embarrassed, reaching for the cloth and the basin. "Your fever's broken," she said. "That's the worst of it past. I'll fetch you something hot." Rose. It was the first time he had said her name when he was fully himself. It stopped her. "Why did you stay?" "You weren't asked. You had every reason not to. It cost you something. I'm not too proud or too foolish to see that. So why?" She looked at him a moment, deciding how much truth a kitchen maid was permitted. Then she gave him all of it, because you needed someone to. And I was someone. That's the whole of it, sir. It didn't seem to me a thing that required a reason. He began to mend, and as he mended, he watched her. He watched how the whole house ran on her quiet hands and had perhaps always run on them, unnoticed. He watched her gentleness with the boy Eli, her patience with the fretful cook, the way the hard men of the ranch softened their voices when she passed. He watched her change his dressing with hands that had earned the right to touch his life, and he found that he looked forward all day to the hour she came. Something had shifted in him that had nothing to do with his leg. He said nothing of it. But Mrs. Pruitt, who missed little, watched Samuel watch the maid, and her mouth set into a thin and worried line. This, she thought, would not do at all. It was Mrs. Pruitt who carried the word upstairs. She did it out of loyalty as she understood it. Loyalty to the order of things, to the engagement that joined two great families, to the propriety that had governed her whole life and given it meaning. She did not think herself cruel. She thought herself the last guardian of a house, in danger of forgetting itself, and so she told Vivian in careful words that the master's recovery had brought him into a great deal of the kitchen maid's company, and that the household had begun to remark on it, and that a wise bride might wish to attend more closely to her betrothed before idle talk took root and spread to Cheyenne. Vivian was not in love with Samuel. She had never pretended otherwise to herself. But she was very much in love with what marrying him would make her, the mistress of the county's largest ranch, a woman of consequence, free at last of her father's narrow house and narrower allowance. She had no intention of losing that to a servant who smelled of broth and tallow. The threat sharpened her as nothing else could have. She rose from her boredom like a cat from a sunbeam, suddenly and completely awake. She came down to the sick room that afternoon in her finest day dress, all warmth and contrition, and she sat at Samuel's bedside and took his hand and apologized prettily for her delicacy. for her weak nerves, for failing him in his hour of need. She had been so frightened, she said. She had never been able to bear the sight of suffering. It was a flaw in her, she knew, a tenderness too acute for this rough country. She hoped he could forgive her. She would do better. She would prove it. And she set about proving it with the full force of a beautiful woman who has decided to be charming. She read to him from the book of poems. She had flowers cut for the sick room, hothouse blooms ordered at great expense from Cheyenne. She arranged her skirts and laughed her party laugh and turned upon Samuel the whole dazzling apparatus that had made men forget their sentences for years, and she made certain, in 100 small ways, that Rose was no longer needed in that room. She spoke to Mrs. Pruitt, and the maid's duties were rearranged. There was a great deal of work in the kitchen, after all, more than ever with the master requiring special meals, and surely it was not fitting for the cook's helper to be forever lingering in the master's chamber when there were two other women perfectly able to carry a tray. Rose found herself sent on errands during the hours she used to tend him. She found the dressing changed by Mrs. Pruitt's clumsier hands before she could reach it. She found the door to the sick room closed, and Vivian's laughter behind it, and no place for herself on the other side. She did not protest. She had spent her life learning the shape of doors closing, and she knew there was no use leaning against them. If she had let herself imagine, and she was honest enough to admit in the privacy of her own heart that she had let herself imagine something foolish, then the imagining had been her own error, and she would not compound it by making a scene that proved Mrs. Pruitt's fears correct. She went back to the kitchen. She rose before dawn and worked till after dark. She saved the bread heels for Eli and answered his worried questions with a calm she did not feel, and at night she lay in her narrow bed in the cold attic room and told herself that she had done a good thing for its own sake and wanted no reward, and almost believed it. What she could not know was that the closed door worked upon Samuel in a way Vivian had not foreseen, for the poems rang hollow, and the flowers had no scent he could trust. Samuel lay in his bed of hothouse blooms and was read to by the most beautiful woman in the county, and he had never felt so alone in his life. He was not a fool. He had run a ranch of 40 men since his 20s. He knew the difference between a thing done for love and a thing done for advantage. Every warmth Vivian showed him, now, he weighed against the memory of her sleeping in the velvet chair while his blood spread across the floor, and the warmth came up light in the scale. He understood that she had been frightened of his suffering. He understood, too, that Rose had been frightened. He had seen it in her trembling hands that first night, and had knelt down anyway. That was the whole of it, he thought. Anyone could be brave who felt no fear. It was the frightened ones who stayed that showed you what they were made of, he asked, after Rose. He asked casually at first, then less so. Vivian had answers ready. The girl was busy. The girl had her own work. Surely he didn't expect a kitchen servant to dance attendance now that he was past danger. Mrs. Pruitt had answers too, all of them reasonable, all of them faintly disapproving, all of them built to make him feel that wanting the maid's company was beneath the dignity of his name. Between the two women a quiet wall was raised, and Samuel, still weak, still confined to the bed and the chair, found he could not easily get past it. It made him think. Lying there through the long convalescent days, with little to do but think, he turned the matter over and over. He thought about his father, who had built the ranch and run it like a ledger, and died with it balanced and cold. He thought about the engagement, arranged across a banker's desk, a merger of fortunes that everyone called a marriage. He thought about what kind of old age waited at the end of a life spent beside a woman who could sleep through his pain. The long evenings, the silence, the particular loneliness of a full house with no warmth in it. He had been raised to believe that a home was a thing you earned and held and kept the accounts of. He was beginning to suspect he had misunderstood the whole arrangement, that a home was not earned at all but made daily by hands willing to do the unbeautiful work of caring when no one was watching and no advantage could be gained. He grew stronger. He took his first steps on the mending leg, leaning on a cane the stable men had cut for him, and the first place he wanted to walk was the kitchen. Vivian found reasons to prevent it. There were visitors, there was a chill in the passage. He needed his rest. Each obstacle was small and reasonable, and together they formed a cage. And Samuel, who had been gentled by fever and pain into a patience he'd never had before, began at last to feel the old hard will returning to him, the will that had taken a single sod house and built an empire on the grass. Then came the evening Eli was sent to the sick room with a tray, the cook being ill, and Samuel asked the boy plainly how Rose did. And Eli, too young and too loyal to know he was being managed, told him. Told him about the errands invented to keep her away, the dressing taken from her hands, the door closed in her face. Told him that she rose before dawn and worked past dark and never said a word against anyone, and that she'd told Eli her staying had wanted no reward and she'd had her good opinion of herself to keep her warm. Told him, finally, that he reckoned Rose was the best person on the whole ranch, and it wasn't fair, and his voice cracked saying it. Samuel sat very still after the boy had gone. Outside, the snow came down on the wide, dark grassland, and somewhere across the cold house, a woman he had nearly married was laughing her party laugh at a guest's dull joke. He looked down at his mended leg, at the small, even scars where a frightened maid had knelt and sewn him back into the world, and the last of his pride went quiet. But pride, once quieted, leaves a man to face what he has nearly done. He resolved to go to her, and rose too quickly, and his half-healed leg buckled, and he went down hard against the bed frame. The crash brought them running, Vivian first, and Mrs. Pruitt, and in the confusion of hands lifting him back to the bed, Vivian's true face slipped for just a moment. "Clumsy fool," she said, low and sharp before she caught herself. "You'll undo everything." It was gone in an instant, smoothed back into sweetness. But Samuel had heard it, and worse than her contempt was the cold thing beneath it. "You'll undo everything," as though he were not a man at all, but a fortune she was nearly finished securing, and his pain only a threat to the closing of the deal. That night he did not sleep. He lay in the dark and let himself feel the full weight of how close he had come. In a few weeks he was to have married Vivian. The county expected it. Both families had agreed it. There was a ring promised, a settlement drawn, a future arranged down to the smallest stone. And he had been content to walk into it the way a man walks a well-worn path, never asking where it led, because asking was not a thing he had been raised to do. He thought of the long years that marriage would have been. He thought of children raised in a house with no warmth in it, learning from their mother that suffering was distasteful, and from their father that a home was only a ledger kept straight. He thought of growing old beside a woman who would sleep through his every pain and call it delicacy. And against all of it he set one image, a plain, tired face gone soft in a chair at dawn, a half-darned sock in her lap, 3 nights of her life spent freely keeping him in the world, and her quiet voice saying it didn't seem to me a thing that required a reason. He had spent his whole life learning to hold what he had earned. He saw now that the only things worth holding were the ones freely given. By the time the window grayed toward morning, he knew exactly what he had to do, and the knowing made him feel, for the first time in months, entirely awake. He waited until the household gathered for breakfast. He dressed himself for the first time since the accident, slow and careful, and took up his cane and walked on his own legs into the long dining room where Vivian sat in her morning silks and misses. Pruitt stood at her station and the cook laid out the dishes. He did not sit. He stood at the head of the table he had eaten alone at for a year, steadied himself on the cane, and asked, in a voice that carried to the kitchen, that Rose Bell be sent for. There was a silence. Mrs. Pruitt did not move. "Now, please," Samuel said quite gently, and something in the gentleness was harder than any shout. And the cook went to fetch her. Roses came in wiping her hands on her apron, certain she was in trouble. She had been pulling bread from the oven when the cook came for her, breathless, saying the master wanted her in the dining room and wanted her now. And in the moment between the kitchen and the dining room door, Rose had time to imagine a dozen failures she might be called to answer for. Perhaps a guest had complained. Perhaps Mrs. Pruitt had at last found grounds to be rid of her. She stepped into the bright room with her chin up and her hands red from the oven and her face braced for dismissal, and found instead that every person at the table was looking at her, and that Samuel Hale was on his feet at the head of it, standing on the leg she had sewn. "You wanted me, sir," she said. "I did." He looked at her a moment, and the whole room seemed to lean toward whatever was coming. "I find I've a debt I've left unpaid too long, and I mean to settle it in front of the house. Since it was in front of the house, I incurred it. 3 months ago, I was carried in here more dead than living, and I lay on that parlor floor, bleeding my life into the rug, and there was not one soul in this house with the courage or the skill to help me, save one, a woman who had every reason in the world to stand back and keep her place, and who knelt down in her fear and saved my life with her own 2 hands, who did not leave my side for 3 days and 3 nights, who asked nothing for it, and was given less than nothing, was sent away in the end, and shut out and made to feel she'd done wrong by doing the only right thing in this house." Vivian had gone very pale. "Samuel," she began, "this is hardly—" "I haven't finished." He did not raise his voice, but it stopped her cold. "I was raised to believe a home is a thing you build and hold and keep the books on straight. I believed it my whole life. I was wrong. A home is the fire people gather to and the hands that keep it lit, and a man can have the largest house in the county and not have a home in it at all, if there's no warmth there. I had no warmth in this house. I never knew it until I was made to lie still long enough to feel the cold." He turned from Vivian then, deliberately, and faced the woman in the apron. "Until you, Rose." The room had gone perfectly silent. Even Mrs. Pruitt had forgotten to disapprove. "I'm not a poet," Samuel went on, lower now, and the hardness had gone out of his voice and left something plainer and truer in its place. "I can't say this the way the books say it. But I know that I lay here for weeks with the most beautiful woman in the county reading me poems, and I was lonelier than I have ever been in my life. And I knew, in my bones, that if I'd been the one bleeding on the floor again, she'd have slept through it again, and called it her delicate nerves. And I know that you were frightened that first night, Rose. I saw your hands shake, and you knelt down anyway. That's the whole of a person right there. Not what they do when it's easy, but what they do when they're afraid and no one's watching and there's nothing in it for them. I've spent my life among brave men who were never tested. You're the first truly brave person I think I've ever known." Rose stood with the oven heat still on her hands and could not find a single word. "I'll not insult you by offering you wages for it," Samuel said. "What you did can't be paid. But there's a thing I can offer, if you'll have it, and I'd rather be refused honestly than accepted out of duty, so I'll say it plain, and you may answer as your heart tells you." He drew a breath. "I'm releasing the engagement. It was a thing arranged across a desk, and it should never have been called a marriage. And I think Vivian will find, when she's honest, that she'll lose nothing she truly wanted." A small sound from Vivian, but he went on. "And I'm asking you, Rosebell, not as a master to a maid, but as one plain honest person to another. Would you like to on in this house? Not as the cook's helper, as its heart, as the woman I'd be proud past speaking to call my wife. If you could ever come to want a stubborn fool who took a broken leg and 3 months to see what was kneeling right in front of him the whole time." For a long moment, Rose did not move. She had spent her whole life learning not to hope for things, because hoping was the surest way to be hurt, and what was being offered to her now was so far past anything she had let herself want that her first instinct was to distrust it, to look for the trick in it, to brace for the floor to drop. But she looked at his face, and there was no trick in it. There was only a man who had nearly died, and had used the long days of his mending to think harder than he'd ever thought, and had arrived at the truth and meant to live by it. And she found, somewhere beneath the years of careful smallness, that the hope was still there after all, that it had never died, only waited. "I was never staying for wages, sir," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. "I think you know that. I'd have stayed for nothing. I nearly did. A breath. But I'll not stay as a thing you're grateful to. If I stay," and here her chin came up, plain and steady, as the night she'd first knelt down, "I stay as your equal or not at all. I've been small in too many houses. I'll not be small in my own." "As my equal," Samuel said, and something broke open in his face that was very near to joy. "I'd have it no other way. I think it's the only honest way two people ever ought to." Across the room, Vivian rose, gathered her silks and her dignity, and swept out without a word, and within the week was gone back to Cheyenne, where in time she married a railroad man who could sleep through anything, and they suited each other well enough. But that was elsewhere, and later. In the bright dining room, on the morning it mattered, the boy Eli let out a whoop he couldn't hold, and the cook began to cry into her apron for the second time that season, though for a far better reason. And even Mrs. Pruitt, who had been so sure she was guarding the house, looked at the two of them and felt the whole shape of her certainty quietly rearrange itself into something warmer and more true. They were married in the spring, when the grass came green across the wide bowl of the valley. It was a small wedding by the county standards, and the largest the ranch hands had ever seen for joy. Rose wore no costly silk. She wore a plain blue dress and her own steady face, and Samuel said afterward he had never seen anyone lovelier. Ely stood up beside them, scrubbed and proud. The long table that Samuel had eaten alone at for a year was crowded now end to end, and warm with talk, and lit by a fire that someone tended because they loved the people gathered to it. A home, it turned out, was never the house at all. It was only ever the hands willing to keep the fire lit. And at last, in that house on the grass, those hands had been given their place.